Hello and welcome. My name is Margit Bantowski. I'm a transformative coach and a Trillium Awakening teacher. Trillium Awakening is a spiritual path that integrates consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality or relatedness. I'm also the host of the YouTube channel called Awakened Activism. Today's topic is hidden agendas, the shadow side of activism, and I will give a brief presentation. And in this presentation, there will be a guided meditation and some journaling questions, so you may want to have a pen and paper handy. And when I go into the journaling questions, you may want to push pause on the video so that you give yourself time to answer the questions. For those of you who are interested in transformative work, then taking the time to do the meditation and the questions, that will be supportive. So I'm going to begin by reading what I could call an invocation. And I offer this as a potential vision of what awakened activism or deep activism can be as a paradigm shifting frame for activism. And then we'll go into the topic of shadow and what gets in the way of us actually realizing this invocation of awakened activism. The raw silk of those low voices, murmuring mysterious magic just below earshot, requiring a different kind of listening for words spoken in a deeper, more primal tongue. These whispers and rumbles, subsonic and slippery, they follow fault lines, places where the veil is thin, where light shimmers in the air and stillness hums even in the wildest storms. Bring your empty cup to the hidden grotto and fill it with the wet murmurings. Raise this brimming chalice to your lips and drink deeply of these rumbling, patterned waters. Let their secrets wash you clean of conceit and ignite sacred seeds of divine will. Let these sacred seeds of divine will germinate and grow, and devote yourself to their flourishing. Keep them moist with grotto water. Follow their intelligence and preferences. Follow their needs. Your purpose, your meaning, your fulfillment is in these given seeds, in their flourishing. Remember, they are not your seeds. They came to you from elsewhere. They were gifted into your care. Love these seeds of divine will with your life. Devote yourself to them. Don't expect to understand them. You're just their custodian. Let their joy be your joy, not the other way around. You are a gardener whose job is to bring seeds to bloom and fruit, to grow into their magnificence, to extend their branches up and out in wide reach, and draw down their roots into dark, rich soil. Be grateful you've been given your set of divine seeds. Cherish your handful, devote yourself completely, and let love pour through you into form this way. Tend your garden and let the goddess do the rest. And I'll just say that I use the word goddess to mean whatever you want the divine to be, the universe, the sacred spirit, life, mystery. So again, that was a journaling rite that I did a few days ago is an invocation for a new form of activism, a new way of taking action and serving based on a new way of being. And it speaks to the possibility of heart, mind, and soul, and action being in greater alignment with a life-giving instead of a life-taking impulse. And this possibility speaks to our actions and intentions being less distorted by what we call shadow. And the word shadow is a term that came from depth psychologist Carl Jung, and it refers to the unconscious parts of our psyche that our ego, the ego is the conscious part of the psyche, that our ego either denies or can't access. So in our unconscious are aspects of our self that were unacceptable as a child, and we hid them away below our awareness so they would be safe and we would be safe. Our shadow includes emotions, feelings that weren't okay to have. It also includes personality traits, our strengths and weaknesses, and just characteristics that weren't okay to express. Our shadow includes feelings about ourselves and beliefs about ourselves that we thought were true, and also feelings and beliefs about the world that we felt were true. So this means that the shadow, our unconscious, can contain both what we call negative or uncomfortable things or disowned things, and then also positive things. So, say you're a really smart kid, but your intelligence wasn't allowed in the family system, then your intelligence, you might have to hide that. And so it's a gift, but it's not allowed, and so it's repressed. So having unconscious, disowned, rejected parts of ourselves is normal. It's part of being human. We all have a treasury of shadow. And here's one of the quirky things about shadow. It's easier to see in other people than it is in ourselves. So by definition, the unconscious means below consciousness, below our awareness. And we can be quite blind to our own shadow, even though that shadow can be obvious and quite stinky and annoying to other people. So, all of us have a friend who, for whatever reason that you can't fathom, keeps choosing, bad relationships that are part of a pattern over and over and over. The same, similar kind of dynamic with partnerships. And it's pretty obviously that they have some unconscious driver making these choices, because consciously they wouldn't, why would one choose suffering that way? And bringing it closer to activism, the stereotype of an angry activism, someone who tries to do good by bullying others. You can see the shadow in that. They might feel very justified in their actions, and they're, really trying to do good in the world. And yet this quality of self-righteousness and supremacy and intolerance and vengefulness is what we could say their shadow. They're not aware of that energy that's driving their actions. And this quality of revenge, if you look at our entertainment industry, so many movies and films and stories are all about revenge. And so this energetic of self-righteous anger is a shadow that runs deep in our culture and also within each of us. So, we all have issues that get really fired up about, and we can be self-righteous. And so just recognizing that those energies are within us. And again, shadow can be really positive. Might have a friend who's gifted creatively, but is unable to own that in themselves. But today we're going to focus primarily on what I call the negative shadow, the unacceptable or uncomfortable aspects of self that we've locked away in our psychic basement. The topic of a golden shadow will be in a different presentation, but it's equally important to liberate and uncover our golden shadow in service of life too. So I don't want to ignore how important that is. So I'm going to go into a guided meditation now, and I'll invite you to settle in and get comfortable in whatever chair, position, couch, floor. It's probably better if you're in a position where you won't fall asleep, but then again, if you fall asleep, maybe that's exactly what you need in this moment. So settling into your body, I invite you to close your eyes. Take some deep breaths. I'm going to invite an inquiry into an aspect of shadow. And with all my meditations, it's an invitation, a suggestion. And if what I'm suggesting doesn't feel right to you, follow your own prompt. There's no right or wrong way to do the guided meditation. I invite you to trust wherever it takes you. But for now, we'll start out with relaxing your body, taking breaths, and with each exhale, softening around any tension you might have in your body. Not trying to get rid of the tension, but just softening around it. And also giving your body weight over to the chair or whatever you're sitting on or lying on. In other words, letting yourself receive the support and feel the support of what's holding you up, and recognizing that underneath your chair or couch or floor, underneath all that is Mother Earth, who holds us 24/7. And if your mind's noisy, just noticing the noise, but bringing your attention to something that's much bigger than the noise. So softening your awareness beyond your mind into both the body and the space around the body, so that your perception holds a much broader field of being. And as you relax into that broader field of being, that includes the body and emotions and mind, but is way beyond it, I invite you to contemplate or allow to emerge a social issue or environmental issue that you find yourself having a strong response to. Something that either breaks your heart or you're angry about. You're really mad that it is the way it is. You feel like it shouldn't be that way. Just something that right now burns for you. Again, it could be a social issue or environmental issue or intersection of both, but something fairly specific. And now sense into what it is about this issue that's hardest for you. What's so hard about this for you? What really bothers you about this the most? Let yourself register what it is that bothers you the most about it. And when you've got an anchor on that, a sense of that, ask that same question again. Now, what is it about that that bothers you the most? That's hardest about that? That's so unacceptable about that? Because ... And now I invite you to take it another step deeper and again ask, so what is so unbearable about that? And right there, I invite you to allow yourself to feel without trying to change the feeling. Just letting yourself feel the unbearability, the essential core unbearability of that piece, that dynamic situation. And now asking yourself, where in my past have I felt that exact same sense of unbearability in my own young life? So don't use your mind, and instead allow your body to reveal where that sense of or unbearability came from in your personal history. And you may or may not have access to that. That's fine. If you don't, just stay with that sense of unbearability and relax around it. Without trying to change it at all. Just encountering it deeply within yourself. And if a memory or a sense of a connection to your early life arose, letting that register in your being, and letting yourself deeply sense and encounter the unbearability of that moment for you. Letting yourself know what was unbearable and the way in which it was unbearable. Again, there's nothing to do other than relax into the direct experience as best you're able. And if there's a way that some part of you is pulling you out of the experience, you might go blank or pop out. That's fine. It means some part of you is taking care of you. Not ready to touch this place yet, and that's just fine. That's trustworthy. And giving thanks to your body and its wisdom, giving thanks to however this meditation unfolded for you. And infusing your whole sense of this with a lot of compassion, deep, deep compassion for the unbearability, for what your experience is and was, how hard it is and was. And if you are able to, if not, that's fine. If you're able to, see if this blanket of compassion that you've just wrapped yourself in can be widened, gently widened, to embrace the whole story, to embrace the whole world. In other words, a little bit beyond right and wrong, making room for the tragedy of the whole thing. Both sides, all sides. And if you can't do that right now, that doesn't want to go that direction, that's totally fine. Starting with being compassionate with ourselves, that's the most important thing. Compassion for the rest of life will come from that. And giving thanks for your journey wherever it took you. And if you want to take a moment to notice your body and the room you're in, and if you want to take a moment to jot down a few things that came from this meditation, go ahead and do so. You can push pause on the video if you would like. And then we'll go into a bit more presentation and unpack the shadow a little bit more. Okay, great. So what you just did was some shadow work. And if it's hard to see our own shadow, this is one way to discover it, to notice what we have strong feelings about, really strong reactions to. That's a clue. And you can take that strong reaction and follow it and dig underneath. And often there's a very personal thread to it. For example, one of the buttons for me is the polar bears, especially images of like the mother polar bear unable to take care of its babies because the ice is thinning and they can't hunt the seals that they need to feed the babies. And when I drop underneath what's so painful about that is like she can't protect her young. And what's so painful about that is like, the little one can't be taken care of. And then what's underneath that? Oh, what's underneath that for me is watching my stepfather abuse my brother, and my mother not being able to step in, and me not being able to step in and prevent that verbal assault from happening. And so some of that venom will get distorted if I don't integrate that part of my shadow. I will lash out with revenge and self-righteousness because the rage of my impotence from that moment will distort my actions. So that's one way of working with shadow, noticing a strong reaction. Another way of recognizing shadow is by looking at projection. And I'm not going to do a meditation around this. I'm going to give you 3 questions. And I invite you to write them down and use them when you notice that you really can't stand someone else. So projection is when someone else is doing something that really annoys you and they shouldn't be doing that and they're just a bad person or whatever it is. And what we're doing is taking this unacceptable behavior or capacity for harm and projecting onto someone else. So question number 1 to write down is, who really bugs you? So just think of a leader or, group of people perhaps. Who really bugs you? Question number 2 is, what about them annoys you? What specific behavior or characteristic drives you nuts? Get really specific. Like, oh, they're so ignorant, or they're so self-righteous, or they're so power hungry. And now the 3rd question is, come up with 3 examples of how you do exactly the same thing, of how you have done or do habitually the same thing. So, it's quite a bit of reckoning to admit that we are capable of the same behavior that we see in our quote-unquote enemies. So just those 2 practices, going deep and looking at projections, go a long way. What I want to do now a little bit is to go into the origins of the shadow, and then how to shift and work with shadow and come into activism from a fundamentally different place of being and doing. So origins of shadow, there's the personal, there's 3 levels. So there's the personal, there's collective and cultural, and existential. So again, personal, cultural, collective, cultural, and existential. So the personal level of shadow, early childhood experiences, not okay to be who you are. Qualities of self get suppressed. Personal is also events that happened in your life that were overwhelming, like death or violence or abandonment. And those can deeply impact our beliefs about ourselves and our beliefs about the world. And those beliefs about the self and the world, the meaning making, infuses our way of moving in the world and making decisions. And these things happen in the context of family and close friends, maybe early school. Then in the broader sense, the second level of shadow is collective. So the local cultural, you're in a liberal or conservative culture, there's the infusion of the local culture, the broader culture, for example, in the United States, there's the value of individuality and strength. And so in our collective unconscious, in the collective shadow in this culture, interdependence is hidden away, vulnerability is hidden away. Those are unacceptable. And those aspects of our humanity, I think, are actually being really illuminated by the COVID pandemic. And it's making it very hard to keep those aspects of our humanity in the shadow. It's becoming much more visible. So cultural values, any culture has a shadow side, things that are not acceptable. Historical influence, and so this is a meta level cultural influence. About 5,000 years ago, the original civilizations, and well, I'll just say for Europe, but there's similar patterns elsewhere, where the early civilizations worshiped the goddess, and the goddess being symbolic of the life force. So there was a reverence for the life force, for all of life. The societies were egalitarian. There was a lot of nurturing and respect for life. And about 5,000 years ago, that started shifting for various reasons into a hierarchical form. Instead of egalitarian, it was hierarchical with male dominance. And what became valued at that point was the taking of life rather than the giving of life, the ability to kill, the ability to control. And so it became male dominated. Women were lower rank and therefore not valued. So resources were seen as acquisition, something to be acquired. And the suppression of the feminine meant the suppression of nurturing, the suppression of supporting life, the devaluing of relationship and the devaluing of interdependence, the devaluing of birth and death and cycles, natural cycles, wanting to control, and also the suppression of the body, sexuality, sensuality, blood, mystery, chaos. Birth was considered unclean. And in the category of body, that is in the shadow of a male-dominated and a domination-based society, is the physical earth herself. So on the cultural shadow level, there's sort of immediate culture, and then there's the dominator paradigm. That's a meta level of shadow. And then the third level of shadow is existential shadow. And what I mean by that is the existential experience of being a separate organism in a world that's out there that we don't have control over. So a separate sense of self in a dangerous world. So without having access to the unified field of being, that sense of separateness results in a pervasive discomfort at the core of the self that leads to a kind of grasping and trying to provide safety by controlling and manipulating and predicting and managing and holding on to things. So that existential rub of being identifying as a separate self in a world that's out of control leads to a shadow of grasping and controlling. So I'm going to offer you a journaling question now, and it has 3 parts to it. So the first part is think about the personal level of shadow and how did that influence where you went in your meditation. How did the personal level of shadow show up in the meditation that you just had? Second question is how did the collective level of shadow show up in the meditation that you just had? And of course, the third question is how did the existential level of shadow show up in your meditation? You can take some time at a future point to journal about that. But if we're going to heal a shadow and integrate, we don't really heal it, we integrate it. We bring it home from the unconscious into awareness, into our wholeness. So sort of in closing, I want to just highlight what I call the devastating mathematics. You take dominator culture plus existential shadow of being vulnerable in an unsafe world. What comes out of that is the hypermasculine impulse to control, predict, strategize, manipulate, extract resources, and take instead of give. And what's happening around the world, culturally and ecologically, can be seen as a symptom of this hypermasculine impulse. In other words, the hypermasculine impulse will hijack our activism if we're unconscious of it. We can't help it. It's the soup we grew up in, the air we breathe, the food we eat. The hypermasculine impulse will hijack our activism if we don't become aware of it. So how do we change it? There's 3 things that I think are essential to shifting out of a hypermasculine impulse and do activism from a different place. One is awakening to our non-separate nature. So in the Trillium Awakening path, we call that whole being realization. We awaken to non-separation. We awaken to the truth of interbeing, that what I do to you, I do to myself. We awaken to the core paradox of being infinite and unbound, and yet deeply embodied in a unique physical entity in a physical world. What awakening gives us is a pervasive trust and wellness at the core of self. Whereas pre-awakening, there's a pervasive ill-at-easeness that will influence our activism. Post-awakening, we can cultivate pervasive trust and wellness of being, which completely changes the energy from which we take action. The second thing, so the first thing is awakening. Second thing is a reclamation of the feminine, whether you're male or female, and everything, the wide, colorful, beautiful spectrum between that polarity, no matter what, the revaluing of the feminine, the capacity to nurture and value life, the capacity to nurture and value the body, our body, each other's body, the earth body, the nurturing and valuing relationships and interdependence, and ultimately making our culture egalitarian, not hierarchical, where masculine and feminine are equally valued. But the feminine has to be valued first in order to bring that back, because we've been so lopsided for so long. And the third critical piece to shift into an awakened activism is to do our shadow work. Personal, collective. Awakening deals with the existential, so personal and collective shadow work. So in closing, I have a poem. It is called A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William Stafford. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others may prevail in the world and follow. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not getting the syncopation right here. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes, no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. So thank you for joining us. If you're interested in Trillium Awakening, check us out at trilliumawakening.org, or I have an awakenedactivism.net website and Awakened Activism on YouTube. Thank you. And may you be a divine gardener of the divine seeds of divine will and express your beauty in the world.